Okay, the book we're discussing is The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism by Edward Baptiste. Now, this is an academic writer, but it is on a popular press, so it is kind of mainstream. And it's a lot in this book. This book was very hard for me to break down, and probably without the help of the class that I'm in, I probably wouldn't have been able to get all of the nuances because it goes in so many different directions. Um, One of the professors I'm studying under actually went to graduate school with this writer, and he knows him well. So we got a very good breakdown of this book and the many nuances and intentions it's trying to address. It is hard to follow as a novice reader or as an academic, because this person adds a purposeful embellishment to make a point based on a historical fact. So if historically there's a slave narrative, which one good thing is there's an attempt to tell the story from the perspective of the slave in The Half Has Not Been Told. Most slavery history is written from the perspective of the slaveholder. Very few histories try to write from the perspective of the slave. That's because there are very few writings on by slaves, and most of the slave perspectives are by way of slave narratives. Now, because those narratives are so limited, what this particular writer chose to do was to embellish the narrative purposefully and overtly, so people knew that that's what he was doing, to make the point of the perspective as he would have guessed it to be based on the narrative given by the slave. A very tricky issue that was in here was, at some point, the author writes, it's actually in the opening, where he states something along these lines. I'm going to try to paraphrase in the interest of time, that descendants of slaves, black people now, many or most, hold a shame because throughout history we allowed this to happen. To summarize it, we allowed this to happen, so there's a shame that's connected to it, which I feel you for trying to address this or even paying attention to it. But as a non-black person, it kind of sounds like the European arrogance that has dominated our history, because that can be looked at and has been looked at in that way by a particular reviewer of this book that challenges the ability of this writer to heal black people of this generational feeling by way of his knowledge, because implicitly this book is supposed to address that, which is supposed to in some way relieve black people of this feeling, which I don't know how well that is received by a white person saying that this exists in the black community. And I don't know of a lot of scholarship that substantiates that this does exist in the black community. I know it's a thought, but I don't think that there is a overwhelming presence of shame connected to black people not stopping it. I think it was maybe a question, but I don't think that there's a lot of scholarship that substantiates that claim. I think that that's just on kind of behalf of the author, which he's received a bit of backlash for that particular opening. I mean, when you start the book like that, it kind of goes downhill for people who don't agree with that portion. There was another portion that he argues that is talking about pushing the pushing system, which is a method of organizing slave labor. And this has been called the gang system. It's been called it was a system used in Jamaican slave history. But in that system, he's talking about the increase of terror and torture to increase production. Now, there's a couple of challenges that exist in some of the reviews associated with this book as to where there is apparently evidence that technology in developing cotton assisted in the increase in production, because two things. Number one, the brutality of slavery. It wasn't like the slave owners got meaner. You know, they did what they did, and the system was so heinous. Pretty much these people were maxed out all the time. So it lacks evidence that as time went on, the slave owners engineered torture to a degree that it doubled and quadrupled production. Now, they did engineer torture. There's evidence of that. But torture connected to productivity, there isn't a lot of correlation, because cotton is not the only product that was the main production in the Western Hemisphere. It was also tobacco. It was also coffee. And what one review was bringing up was, okay, why didn't the slave owners in tobacco use the same torture techniques that were used in cotton to increase productivity? Because the productivity of tobacco stayed the same, but cotton increased. So he's saying it's more logical that something was being done within the production of cotton as opposed to the torture. So that he's saying the torture stayed the same. If the cotton people increased their products by their productivity by torturing the people, the tobacco people would have tortured the tobacco slaves to increase as well. A valid point. I think it's kind of hard to ignore that. There were a lot of arguments concerning the consistency of facts, but we're saying one of the cornerstones of this work is the observation that the quantity of cotton picked per day per slave increased 3 to 4 times between 1800 and 1860. And that's where this particular argument takes place, 1800 to 1860. Baptist is saying torture increased, which made production increase, whereas Alan Olmsted is saying that there were innovations in the manipulation of the cotton product or the cotton plant that increased this. There was another, many African American students struggle with a sense of shame that most of their ancestors could not escape suffering in the slave experience. That was the point that I was talking about earlier, and that was a very popular review that was by Dr. Trayvon Logan, who is a black guy, and was saying, wow, I find that odd that you as a white person would take on this elevated position to relieve the minds of black people in that way. I think Baptiste had a point of really using slavery. He wants to point out the viciousness of slavery and put it in the face of the American beneficiary of that system, and may overshoot it, which is causing, one, you're going to have the general beneficiary is going to push against it because that is historically what has happened in our country. If any fact or any inflated or inaccurate fact or flaw can be found at all, that's done to reduce the entire argument or the entire work. So, again, it's a lot in this book. Definitely a book that you're going to have to read several times and with somebody. This is probably a higher level reading, not something easily covered in 10 minutes. So it looks like I went a little over. But again, The Half Has Not Been Told by Edward Baptiste.